This presentation is on price discrimination. It's longer than my normal presentations, so if you look on the bottom left of the screen, you'll see there's certain slides where I reckon it might be possible to take a break if you've had enough microeconomics at that point and come back to it later, as if anyone can have enough of microeconomics. Now, the cartoon at the top of this screen gives some ideas to how price discrimination works. Jason is selling coffee for $1, and as you can see, that consumer is unhappy about paying $1, and they tell Jason that they are desperate for a coffee. So Jason then says, okay, it's not $1, it would normally be $1, but now it's $5. Now, there's a fair chance that price discrimination isn't going to come up on your paper at all. It's a fairly small part of a fairly small part of the spec. It could come up as a low mark section A or the 5 marker on section B, where basically you're trying to identify or define it, that sort of thing. But it could also be a high mark data response one. And the thing that I hope doesn't happen to you is that it comes up as one of the essay questions, because it is quite sophisticated. So imagine that you want a pair of Air Max 95 trainers that cost 140 quid. So you nip into JDSports and you say, right, if I was to buy these trainers tomorrow, how much would they cost? Well, the assistant would say 140 quid. What about next week? 140 quid. What if I come back in a month's time? 140 quid. What if I change my gender? It's 140 quid. Or my religion? 140 quid. Or I change where I live? 140 quid. Or was a student? 140 quid. And at this point, hang on. Did you say student? Yep. Students get a 10% discount. Look at the top right side of that screen. Oh, fantastic. So if I'm a student, I'm only going to be paying £126 for the trainers. Yeah. So what if I'm a student and I come back tomorrow? 126 quid. What about next week? 126 quid. What if I change my gender? 126 quid. And at this point, probably it will be in your interest to run for it, because the assistant would probably want to lamb you one. So what if you want a Ryanair flight from London to Venice? Well, if you want to go on the 25th of September, it would have been £229 bar a penny. Well, what if you want to go a day later? £69.99. What about the following day? £59.99. What about the following Wednesday for exactly the same flight? £28.99. If you look down for the 4th of October, £18.99. If you look down on the 1st of November, £16.99. Following day, 2nd of November, £142.99. Go back to the 26th of October, £61.99. It's up by quite a lot. Think about it. When are the school holidays? So it's two different firms. JDSports, literally two prices was all I could find for the same pair of trainers. The price difference was 11% between the two. If you go from 126 to 140, it's 11%. Ryanair, the cheapest was £17, but for exactly the same journey, the most expensive was £229. I found 9 other prices, so that's 11 prices in all in a 5-week period. And the percentage difference from the cheapest to the most expensive was 1,247%. So JDSports, not a lot of changing prices, discriminating prices. Ryanair, massive. And Ryanair aren't that dissimilar to things like rail journeys. You could perhaps go down by rail to somewhere and it will cost you a few quid. On a different day, it will cost you 20, 30, 40, 50, £100. And that is what price discrimination is. It's selling exactly the same product to different consumers at different prices for reasons other than cost. And that's the introductory stuff done. So if you want to take a little pause there, great. There are 3 types of price discrimination. First degree is perfect price discrimination. Under perfect price discrimination, you are charging every single consumer the maximum that they individually are prepared to pay for the product. So you are converting all of their consumer surplus into producer surplus. As you can see there on the diagram, each consumer is being charged according to the demand curve. So the person who's most desperate to get hold of the good, they'll be charged most. Now, normal auctions like eBay are reasonable approximations of first degree price dim. Broadly speaking, you bid up the price until there is only one person remaining. It's not quite there because you've just gone 1 penny above what the second person was prepared to pay. You haven't necessarily hit the price, the maximum price that that buyer is prepared to pay. Now, with a Dutch auction, the auctioneer starts from a high price and then drops the price until someone moves into the market. So they will pretty much literally be charging exactly the highest amount that that individual consumer is prepared to pay. So in the example above, someone is selling a tulip. They start at $100,000. They drop the price to 50, then 40, then 30, then 20, and at 20, the guy in purple puts his hand up, so it's sold to that gent in purple for $20,000. And if there was another tulip being sold, the price would come down below 20,000 until the next person, perhaps that person in orange, wanted to buy. If you're interested in why tulips is used as the example, then at the end of this video, Google the Dutch tulip bubble and you'll see why. Second degree price discrimination is where if someone wants to buy in bulk, they'll be charged a lower amount than someone who does not buy in bulk. The company lastminute.com engages in second degree price discrimination a lot. It basically does the buying. So imagine that a theatre with a capacity of 500 puts on a show. It's selling the tickets for 60 quid each, and it manages to sell 300 of those tickets. But a few days before the show, it can't sell any more. So what it will do is it will sell the remaining 200 tickets in bulk to lastminute.com, say for 20 quid. Now, bearing in mind that the marginal cost of someone going along to a theatre is virtually zero, that 20 quid represents revenue for the theatre company without having to pay a cost. So what do lastminute.com do with it? Well, they put it on their website and they might be able to shift those 200 tickets to individuals who might be prepared to pay, say, 30 quid each. So lastminute.com will be making a profit of £10. 500 people are seeing the play. Presumably most of them are going to enjoy the play, but at least we know that the 300 who bought at 60 quid, they're going to enjoy the play because they are fanatics. And the others are going to enjoy it as well. So pretty much everyone sort of wins. Third degree price discrimination is the one that we look at most of all for the spec, and that is charging a different price to different consumer groups for the same product. And there are loads of ways of doing it. You could discriminate by time. The example that I gave of Ryanair, clearly it was changing depending upon what day you were travelling. Age, probably benefited from getting young person's tickets at some point for something. Gender, income, ethnicity, geography, religion. Provided that you can identify groups, then you may be able to price discriminate. No, may, not will. So what are the conditions? Well, the first one is obvious. For a firm to price discriminate, it's got to have some ability to change price, so it's got to have some monopoly power. I would not go into that in any great detail on an answer if I were you. It's got to be able to clearly identify two or more sub-markets, and the key thing is those sub-markets must have different elasticities of demand. And the third thing, it's got to have some ability to stop people from the cheaper sub-market selling their goods on to people in the more expensive sub-market, because that of course would mean that the firm would not be getting those people's purchases. Now that is called market seepage or arbitrage, and if that goes on to a great extent, then firms cannot third degree price discriminate easily. Well, I gave the example of Ryanair. So in that top left slide, you can see some of the factors that affect the air market. Well, clearly, you've got identifiable sub-markets. If you look at that business person on the top left, they're checking their time. They're desperate to be perhaps in Paris in order to attend a business meeting. Similarly, they're backed up by a firm who tend to have more money than individuals. Or you've got the holiday submarket. People will tend to have less money, but have a look at that one on the top right. Why have I got children? Because families can only travel on holiday at certain times, and their needs might be different. Some might want to go to Rome to see the Colosseum, some might want to go to Paris to see the Eiffel Tower, or some might just want to go and see a site. So some are going to be more elastic than others, but generally speaking, they are going to be more elastic than that business person who absolutely has to travel at that particular time. So how do you keep the market separate? Well, that passport there. In order to travel, you need a passport. You need to clearly identify yourself as an individual. So you couldn't buy it in a cheap market and sell that same ticket on in a more expensive sub-market, because you are linked to that particular passport. So that's why Ryanair are able to engage in extensive price discrimination. So what about train? Well, you've got the commuter market, people who have got to get to work by a certain time, or students who have got to get to college by a certain time. But no, there's a difference between them. With students, you might be able to get some sort of discount because students are poorer. So you're discriminating not only by time, but also by income. Similarly, you can get senior rail cards. Where again, older people tend to have a bit more time on their hands if they've retired, so they have choice, whereas a worker does not have choice. Similarly, if you look down the bottom of that slide, just on the top left, top right actually, you can see that there's a family who again may have different needs. Now the bottom left is my JDSports example. There are clearly identifiable subgroups in this market. There's men, there's women, there's high income people, there's low income people, there's pensioners, people who just want to stay fit rather than die. All of those can be clearly identified. But the problem is that if JDSports were to practice extensive price discrimination, it would be dead easy for someone in a cheap market to buy the goods and then sell on to somebody in the more expensive inelastic market. So it's very difficult for them to avoid arbitrage, therefore they can't price discriminate by much. Now, the slide on the bottom right, pharmaceutical firms are often criticised because they often charge quite a lot for drugs in the third world. Now, clearly, you can identify third world countries. Have a look at that map. You will know which of those are a third world and which of those aren't. So you can clearly see, say, a country's Nigeria or Zambia or Bangladesh. They are poorer countries than, say, Britain or America or Japan. Their incomes, on average, are clearly different, much lower in the third world than in the first world, which is one of the conditions for elasticity of demand, the proportion of your income that you spend on a product. So again, that sets up the possibility for extensive price discrimination. But just like with JDSports, it's very difficult to prevent arbitrage. Let's say that a pharmaceutical firm was selling a drug in the third world for $100 and the same drug in America for $1,000. Well, there's very little to stop someone in the third world buying the drug for $100, putting it in a jiffy bag and selling it to someone in America, say, for $500. So it's really difficult to avoid arbitrage in that particular market. So generally speaking, how does third degree price discrimination work? Well, in the elastic sub-market, firms drop their prices, but they don't have to drop them by much to attract additional demand because demand is elastic. So to get rid of the same number of customers from the inelastic market, they raise the price. But because it's an inelastic market and consumers want that particular product, they can raise the price by quite a lot. So they don't drop it by much in the elastic sub-market, and they increase it by quite a lot in the inelastic sub-market. And I think from there you can see how firms make their profits. Again, this could be a good place to pause because we're going to get into the diagrams now. So for the diagrams, you need an inelastic sub-market and an elastic submarket. You'll notice here I've done the standard thing. I've drawn both the AR curves and the MR curves. I've drawn the MR curves being roughly half the horizontal distance to the AR curve from the origin. Now this next bit is quite tricky, and I'd suggest that you use a ruler. I'm going to start my diagram for the market as a whole at the point at which the elastic market starts. So all of the demand at that point comes from the inelastic market. And then I'm just going to take one other point, doesn't matter where you take it, and I'm going to add the AR, the demand from the inelastic market and the elastic market. That's going to give me a second point on the AR curve, and that is going to give me a straight line. And I can again draw the MR curve as roughly half of the AR curve for the market as a whole. Because we are only producing a good, we only need one MC curve. And I'm going to put that on the whole market diagram. And I'm going to show from there the price, the profit maximizing price that would be charged if this market was not price discriminating. So it's your standard MC equals MR, chase it up to the demand curve, and that's going to give me a price of P where we're going to be selling a quantity of Q. But I'm going to chase that MC position back to the individual sub-markets. I'm just going to draw a horizontal line back to the individual sub-markets. And then within those sub-markets, I'm going to still apply the MC equals MR condition, but I'm going to apply it to each individual sub-market. So if we go to the yellow market, the inelastic sub-market on the left, you can see that that's going to involve a pretty huge increase in price. Whereas with the elastic sub-market, the one in the middle, the turquoisey one, you can see that price comes down slightly from the original red price. So I'd like you to think about that diagram, and then I'd like you to take a quick pause, because I'm going to give you a simpler version of the diagram in a minute. If you can draw this one, fantastic. If not, there is a get out. Now my get out does not involve drawing the diagram for the market as a whole. So it is a lot more straightforward. You still need the inelastic market and the elastic market. And to make it even easier, we're going to assume that marginal cost is zero. And for an awful lot of firms that practice price discrimination, the marginal cost is zero. So for rail firms, their costs aren't going to rise if an extra customer gets on the train. Same with the theatre. You know, unless that someone on a train is incredibly fat, on a plane is incredibly fat, they're unlikely to increase the total cost of running that plane or train by much at all. So MC equals zero is not a bad approximation. So all I'm doing there is I'm chasing that back to, again, on the inelastic submarket, I'm taking it to where the MR curve is zero, because MC equals MR. So if MC is zero, MR is zero as well. You can see that means that we're going to be charging PI in that submarket, and we're going to be charging PE in the elastic submarket. So again, what you are showing is price discrimination, and the examiner might be happy with that. But you then need a much more detailed explanation. If you've got away with an easier diagram, you do need to explain it. And all you're doing is you are saying that in the inelastic submarket, you can increase price by quite a lot and not lose a lot of demand. Whereas in the elastic submarket, you can get that demand by dropping the price by not a lot. So again, you're still saying the price goes up by a lot in the inelastic submarket, and it doesn't fall by much in the elastic submarket. Again, if you didn't pause before, you might want to pause now, because I've just given you a different version of the diagram. So what about the winners and losers? Well, the winners are the producers. How do I know that? Who chooses to price discriminate? It's the producers. They wouldn't do that if it wasn't going to improve their profit. And what they are doing is they are converting some consumer surplus into producer surplus. They're selling exactly the same output, so their costs are going to be roughly the same. They might have a few additional costs, perhaps by issuing identity cards, that sort of thing. But their revenue is going to rise. So either way, producer surplus is another word for profit, and more revenue in the same cost is another word for profit. So producers are going to be happy. They are definitely the winners. So if producers win, who loses? Well, that consumer surplus is being translated into producer surplus. So generally speaking, consumers lose. And if you're in the inelastic market, you're going to be doubly cross because you are the consumer specifically that lose. So if you're a commuter, you'll be paying a very heavy price for your season ticket or your rail travel. So you'll be particularly unhappy. However, a little bit of evaluation, as a young person, you've normally benefited from price discrimination. You're getting often cheap cinemas, cheap travel, and similarly, if you're an old person, you tend to be able to get things like senior travel. If you're a pensioner, you can choose, say, when you go to the cinema or whatever. You might be able to get special discounts if you're on benefit. So if you're an elastic consumer, and often these elastic consumers are poor, you don't tend to get a lot of rich students, then you're going to be happy with it. So that is going to be an aspect of evaluation for you. However, it isn't always the poor that benefit from price discrimination. Think back to that example for Ryanair. When do you get the more expensive tickets to go to Venice? Well, it tends to be during the school holidays. There's a rich group of people who are known as dinkies. They are a marketer's dream. Dinkies, double income, no kids yet. So it's a couple who have yet to start a family. They have a lot of choice as to when they go on holiday. They are not restricted to school holidays, so they perhaps could pick up one of the £18 or £19 tickets from Ryanair to Venice, whereas if you're a family who have to go in the school holidays or could be fined by the school, they are going to be more harmed by that. So we've actually managed to evaluate our evaluation, and examiners love it if you can do that. Now, to finish up, let's have a look at a couple of special cases. Well, there are some firms that could not make a profit unless they price discriminated. So they'd be facing an average cost curve that is above the average revenue curve. That means it'll make a loss. No firm can continue in business in the long run if it makes a loss, so it would go out of business. So this could be perhaps a theatre, or it could be a rail company. Now, if you're not a firm, you are not a theatre, then you can't put on plays. And if you can't put on plays, then that can't make any consumer happy. Similarly, it can't make a profit. It can't bring in new money. So there's going to be no consumer surplus and no producer surplus. So if with price discrimination, it makes them a viable firm, that will make both consumers happy and producers happy. And the final example is where you use price discrimination to spread out demand. So this tends to happen with railways or holiday firms, whatever. Railways tend to charge more before 9:30, less afterwards. Holidays tend to charge more at school holiday time when the families can get away. Now, the thing about these particular firms, let's imagine that they were not allowed to price discriminate. Well, at peak times, they run at full capacity anyway. You don't have a lot of spare space on railways at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock. You don't have a lot of spare space in holiday parks. So what would happen if price fell at peak time because they weren't allowed to price discriminate? Well, if price falls, demand goes up. But they are running at full capacity, so they couldn't meet that excess demand. So you'd have a lot of unhappy consumers who would like to go on holiday, but actually can't go on holiday because the place is full up, even though it's cheaper. So that wouldn't necessarily be a good thing for most consumers. Well, similarly, off-peak price would have to rise. And so as a result of that, your elastic consumers would be put off. Now, remember that a lot of firms, a lot of holiday firms off-peak, or a lot of trains off-peak, are largely empty. So what you are doing is you are emptying already largely empty trains or holiday camps. So therefore, that again would not be a good thing. The costs of running these firms wouldn't change by much. You've still got to pay your rent, you've still got to pay your staff, you've got to still pay a lot of other things for upkeep. So if you've got fewer customers off peak and no more customers at peak, but you're making less revenue, then your average costs are going to rise and your profits are going to fall. You may well resort to raising your prices even more. So what price discrimination does there is it evens out those demand fluctuations. Now you'll be pleased to know that we've pretty much finished it there after about 25 minutes. So thanks for listening.